For years, Kim Jong Un was seen as Russia's pupil, the lesser dictator learning from Putin's empire. But in June of 2024, the roles were reversed. Putin, isolated and desperate, signed a pact with Pyongyang, believing he would gain reinforcements. What he actually got were paper soldiers, hunger, and empty promises. Meanwhile, Kim was accumulating money, prestige, and access to Russian technology. Today, you'll see how the apprentice deceived the master, and why this deal may mark the beginning of the definitive decline of Russian influence. While Putin tried to maintain the image of an emperor, the reality on the battlefield told a very different story. Russia was no longer the feared superpower. It was an exhausted empire, struggling to stay upright with borrowed parts and temporary allies. The war in Ukraine had already cost hundreds of thousands of casualties. The country was facing an unprecedented military manpower crisis. Young men fleeing conscription, overworked arms factories, and an army worn down by poorly planned campaigns. With Western sanctions choking the economy and cutting off access to critical components, Moscow found itself cornered. The Eastern Front, especially around Avdiivka and Pokrovsk, had turned into a grinder for both men and machines. And that's when the Kremlin began searching for muscle beyond its borders. By mid-July, satellite images revealed something never seen before. Railway convoys coming from Russia's Far East, carrying troops and equipment marked with North Korean insignias. Around 11,000 North Korean soldiers crossed the border through the Kherson route, divided into two categories. Roughly 2,000 were integrated into Russian combat units, operating in secondary sectors of the front under direct supervision of Russian army officers. The other 9,000 were assigned to rear area duties, digging trenches, repairing fortifications, guarding logistics posts, and watching over ammunition depots. Officially, Moscow called them technical support forces. In reality, they were cheap replacements for Russian soldiers who had been killed, wounded, or had simply gone missing in action. But the move didn't go unnoticed. In Brussels, NATO's command labeled the deployment of North Korean troops as a dangerous and unprecedented escalation. For the first time, Moscow's support wasn't just material. It was human. Foreign soldiers were now fighting, even if indirectly, on European soil. The Western response came quickly and quietly. Authorization for Ukraine to use long-range missiles, such as the American ATACMS and the British Storm Shadow, inside Russian territory. In other words, the message was clear. If Moscow wanted to turn this conflict into a war of alliances, the West could raise the stakes too. But what Putin got in return for this so-called military assistance wasn't reinforcement. It was a poisoned gift, because when the first North Korean units arrived at the front, the Russians quickly realized they weren't receiving soldiers. They were receiving a problem. These men weren't Kim Jong Un's elite troops, far from it. They were, for the most part, the rejects of the North Korean army, soldiers with records of misconduct, poor physical fitness, or simply discarded from active service. Men with no training, no discipline, and no motivation. Instead of ideological fighters, they were clumsy, poorly prepared men sent more to relieve Pyongyang's internal pressure than to win a war in Europe. Among Russian officers, the assessment was unanimous. They can't even pitch a tent properly. The problem is that the North Korean military survives more on propaganda than actual efficiency. Outwardly, it's all perfect parades and immaculate uniforms. Inside, it's a force trapped in the 1970s. Training is minimal and completely outdated. Repetitive drills, fake ammo simulations, and zero access to modern combat systems. The tanks used for training are still old Soviet T-55 models, and infantry training is done with rusty AK-47 rifles and rationed ammunition. In practice, an average North Korean soldier spends more time marching for propaganda cameras than doing live-fire exercises. And the hardship doesn't stop there. The regime has faced chronic shortages of fuel and ammunition for years. Many battalions don't even have vehicles for transport, and the few that do are powered by adulterated fuel collected from farms and civilian plants. Without fuel, troops are forced to march for miles, often wearing worn-out boots, patched uniforms, and lacking proper rations. When they were sent to Russia, dozens of soldiers reportedly collapsed during transport, according to Ukrainian intelligence intercepts. Russian authorities themselves had to provide winter uniforms and food rations, since Kim's troops arrived without basic gear, without blankets, and with torn footwear. But perhaps the most shocking picture comes from what the Russians called a discipline crisis. Sources tied to Russia's 25th Army Corps, responsible for integrating North Koreans in rear-line sectors, reported that many soldiers simply refused to work. They couldn't physically endure the effort of digging trenches for hours. Some, according to testimonies, deserted or stole food from Russian supply depots. One Russian soldier described it with bitter irony. They eat twice as much, work half as hard, and sleep 3 times more. And there's a brutal explanation behind that: hunger. North Korea is facing one of its worst food crises since the 1990s. It's estimated that nearly 40% of its military suffers from chronic malnutrition. Many of these soldiers, before being sent to Russia, spent more time growing potatoes and rice than training for combat. In North Korean barracks, it's not uncommon for troops to be forced to plant, harvest, and cook their own food just to survive. That rural habit, blending army life with agriculture, was carried onto the Russian battlefield. Instead of fighting, some groups were seen trying to grow small vegetable gardens near fortification posts. A perfect image of how Kim Jong Un's reinforcement became a laughingstock among the Russians themselves. But the most ironic part is that, even in this scene of failure, Kim came out ahead. While Moscow was bearing the cost of feeding and equipping a starving foreign army, Pyongyang was quietly celebrating. Because Kim Jong Un's real plan was never to help Russia. It was to get rid of his regime's dead weight. The 11,000 soldiers sent to Russia weren't chosen for their competence, but for their convenience. They were the burdens of the North Korean army, men the regime couldn't officially dismiss, but also didn't want to keep. Among them were undisciplined, sick, politically suspect, or simply useless soldiers by Pyongyang's strict loyalty standards. For Kim, this was an elegant way to eliminate an internal problem without appearing cruel, turning a purge operation into a gesture of support for a Russian ally. In other words, he traded a hunger problem for an opportunity of profit and prestige. And profit was exactly what he got. Each soldier sent to Russia brought in around $2,000 for the North Korean regime, money that never reached the soldiers' hands but went straight into the coffers of the Workers' Party. Adding up the total contingent, Pyongyang pocketed over $20 million just from the initial deployment, plus bonuses in supplies and fuel. But the real payment wasn't in cash, it was in military technology promises. Western intelligence sources indicate that, in exchange for this assistance, Moscow promised partial transfers of aeronautical technology and access to MiG-29 and Su-27 fighter jet components, models North Korea has been trying to copy for years, without success. These agreements also included technical aid for jet propulsion and radar systems, something that could accelerate Kim's air program by nearly a decade. And it didn't stop there. North Korean scientists were discreetly invited to visit Russian nuclear research centers under the guise of energy cooperation. In practice, that meant access to data that could strengthen Pyongyang's ballistic and nuclear programs, the same ones that openly challenged the United States and Japan. Kim Jong Un got exactly what he always wanted: technological modernization without losing internal control. He turned starving soldiers into bargaining chips and made Putin pay dearly for it, with resources, with influence, and with reputation. But the masterstroke didn't end there. With the pact sealed, North Korea repositioned itself on the global chessboard, emerging as a new pillar of the anti-Western axis alongside Russia and China. This triad, Beijing, Moscow, and Pyongyang, began operating as an informal network of military, economic, and political support. And Kim, the apprentice, earned himself a seat at the table of the powerful, using Russia's collapse as a springboard for his own rise. Today, he presents himself not as the dictator of a starving nation, but as a strategic player in a world divided between the West and the new Asian bloc. And while Putin struggles to stay afloat politically, Kim Jong Un thrives in the shadow of chaos, fueled by Russian money and shielded by Chinese diplomacy. The move that once seemed strategic turned into a disaster waiting to happen. For Putin, the deal with North Korea became yet another symbol of weakness, a perfect portrait of an empire still trying to look powerful while sinking into its own desperation. The consequences came fast. Russia received useless troops, incapable of reinforcing the front lines and, in many cases, becoming a logistical burden. While Kim Jong Un gained prestige and money, Moscow was hit by a new wave of attacks. ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles now crossed the border, striking depots, airfields, and railway stations inside Russian territory. The agreement that was supposed to strengthen Russia ended up opening the door for the West to intensify its strikes, turning Kim's assistance into a political and military nightmare. The image of a great anti-Western alliance that the Kremlin tried to sell fell apart in record time. Behind the scenes, Russian generals openly criticized the decision to accept foreign troops without unified command, while Western diplomats described Putin as a cornered leader, willing to accept any humiliation for political survival. But Putin's dilemma is that he can't back down. Breaking the pact with Pyongyang would mean admitting weakness, and he desperately needs to maintain the illusion that Russia still has allies, that the country isn't isolated, even if those allies are authoritarian and unpredictable regimes. For the Russian public, the government tries to sell the story that the North Korean fighters are heroic comrades, but in the trenches, the reality is very different. No one wants to fight beside them. For Russian soldiers, sharing the front line with North Koreans feels more like a punishment, a constant reminder that the army, which was once a source of national pride, now depends on reinforcements from a collapsing nation. The future of this alliance doesn't look any better. Military experts already speculate that North Korean contingents will be used as cannon fodder, thrown into saturation tactics, the same meat grinder strategy Putin uses against Ukraine. Starving, poorly equipped men sent in waves just to wear down enemy defenses while Russian troops retreat or regroup, a strategy that perfectly reveals how much value Moscow places on the lives of its allies. None. In the end, Kim Jong Un was the true strategist of this story. He turned an internal problem into profit, used Putin's desperation as a springboard, and secured his place in the new axis of power challenging the West. Putin, meanwhile, ended up more isolated, more vulnerable, and with even less control over the very war he started. The irony is brutal. While the master bleeds on the battlefield, the apprentice reaps the rewards of war. In the end, the question is simple. Who do you think really came out on top of this deal? Putin, who bought himself paper allies, or Kim Jong Un, who turned human scrap into global influence? And if you thought Russia had already hit rock bottom with that deal, wait until you see what it did next. Soviet-era tanks, literally pulled from the scrapyard, are back on the battlefield. Click now on the video appearing on your screen and see how Putin's zombies are trying to fight a war that belongs to the past. And don't forget to subscribe to The Military Ground. See you there.